So Cindy Finneseth, Kentucky Horticulture Council, we're one of the organizers of the short course. And this short course really was a direct response to requests that we'd gotten from beginning growers and people who were interested in growing. So we put these 3 nights together, had a great program last night. We've got a great program tonight with Rachel. Just a couple housekeeping things. This is webinar style, so you don't have to worry about your video or your sound. You can be as loud as you want to be. It's not going to disturb anybody. But if you would put your comments or questions, those kinds of things, you can put them in the chat box or you can put them in the Q&A. And as we go along tonight, we will, be sure and address those questions that you may have. Another thing that wanted to point out is the link that you use to register tonight. That's the same all tonight, tomorrow. So if you have to hop off and hop back on, just use that same link tomorrow. Easy to join in. One thing that you will notice when you log out is a survey will pop up. So we really would appreciate your input. Let us know how we did tonight. And then there's also kind of an open response if you have other suggestions for us. But that really does help us know how we did and what kinds of things that we can do better. I think that is it from what we're going to cover tonight. Rachel's got a great program lined up. She's going to cover just some of the basics about production and then talk about ID 36. And if you did not pick up a copy or you didn't have a copy of ID 36 or you didn't get the link, I'll drop that in the chat box and you can pull it up. If you're on a phone, that's going to be kind of difficult to see, but certainly if you're on a computer, you can have that in another window and be looking at that as we go along. But I'm sure you're tired of hearing from me and you want to get to the real meat of the program tonight. So I want to introduce you to Dr. Rachel Rudolph. She's an Extension Vegetable Specialist at the University of Kentucky. And Rachel, tell us everything that we need to know in the next 2 hours with a couple breaks. Okay?
Wow. No pressure.
None at all.
Okay, well, I'll do my best. Thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you all for tuning in. I'm guessing you can see my screen. Does that sound right, Mackenzie and Cindy?
Yes, you're good.
Yeah,
perfect.
Good.
Thanks. Okay. So yeah, we're going to cover vegetable production systems, and so we'll go over the big 4, right? So open field, row cover and low tunnels, high tunnels, and greenhouses. And we'll talk about site selection for each system and the advantages, disadvantages, and considerations. Maybe they're not quite disadvantages, but definitely some things you need to think about, and potential costs to consider. So a caveat with that is, I'm not an ag economist. I'm going to give you some general values that I have, or that that we have paid for things. And it's not going to be comprehensive, but it will give you a roundabout idea. And then tomorrow I'm talking about equipment, where I'll again touch a little bit more on cost. So let's jump right in here. So in general, right, you can pretty much say this about across the board. Vegetable crops perform best when planted into soil with good drainage and in areas that receive full sun. That is generally, you can pretty much count on that. So some things to consider if you're just thinking about open field, right, just regular crop production, and thinking about where you're gonna grow your vegetables, is the field topography. And what we mean by that is the physical characteristics of the field site, contour, soil depth, drainage, if there's any trees or rocks, right? Thinking about that. And so specifically drainage, that's huge. Vegetable plant roots do not like to be wet for an excessive amount of time. And what I mean by wet is, standing water. So drainage is really important when selecting a site. So it depends on the soil type and the topography. And if you're not sure, right, you can go to this website, Web Soil Survey. You can type in the address and you can zoom in on like a tiny field in your area, and it will give you the soil type. And that should give you an indication of how well draining it is, right? So if it's like a sandy loam or a loamy sand, right, then you know you're pretty good. If it's a clay, right, then you need to think about things and maybe choose a different site. And so this is just an example. This photo is an example of what I saw when I looked up the horticulture research farm, right? And then you can zoom in, and like this field, specifically this field, my cursor keeps disappearing on me. This field will, it can tell us exactly like this field right here, what it is. It's pretty amazing. And so if we have time later, you know, at the end of the program and people are confused or have questions, I might be able to do a demo of the web soil survey if people want. So thinking about, and this goes for all, you know, any production system in not just open field, but also high tunnel and the low tunnels. So thinking about the soil type, chemical, physical, and biological, and all those properties are really important. And so what do we mean by that, right? So the physical properties would be the aggregate stability, the bulk density, the rooting depth, water infiltration, water holding capacity. The soil, the chemical properties would be soil pH, cation exchange capacity, organic matter, all those available nutrients, right? NPK, calcium, magnesium, all the micronutrients. And then thinking about the microbiology, the microbial community, earthworms, plant pathogens, right? It's not all good, right? Enzymes. And then water availability, water quality. And then really, if you've just moved to a place, right, or you're thinking about buying land and you're not sure on the site history, be sure to ask. Be sure to investigate that. What was there before? What was, if you're moving to someone else's farm, right? You're buying a farm, make sure you ask those questions. What was here? What did they apply? Maybe they had to use herbicides, right? And that might affect future vegetable production for a couple of years. What will the cropping history mean for vegetable production, right? That's the bottom line of what you need to get to with site history. And then of course, weather or climate. So is it in a low spot and it's going to have, you know, really cold air coming to it, or are you in a flood zone, a floodplain, right? Thinking about things like that. Do you get a lot of wind in that area? For example, the horticulture research farm is a pretty windy place. So if it's 10 miles an hour in the city of Lexington, it's 15 or 20 at the farm, right? And so, and the wind pretty much always blows in one direction. And so taking note of those kind of things is really important. So here's just some examples of open field production, right? Just, you know, we're just talking soil and plants, right? Certain crops do pretty well, just pretty simple, right? Cabbage, the cucurbits, squash, and sweet corn do really well, just open field, bare ground production. Now, weed management, as you can see, is extremely important. It can really become a problem with competing for nutrients, competing for water, and also just getting in the way of clean harvest. So plasticulture is pretty much, you know, it is common, accepted, standard practice now in vegetable production and has been for quite some time. So it's combining raised beds, this plastic mulch you see, and drip irrigation. And so the plastic mulch usually refers to black polyethylene film. It's pretty thin. It's a couple, you know, millimeters in thickness, and it's disposable. So mulch is applied with a tractor drawn mulch layer. There are some implements that can be drawn by horse, believe it or not. But typically it's drawn by a tractor. It shapes the bed, it lays mulch, and the drip tape is underneath, is pulled in a line underneath, and that all happens in one pass. And if you've done the appropriate field prep in advance, it'll look pretty good. So making sure that, the field has been worked appropriately before shaping the beds and laying the mulch, that's going to be really important. So the benefits of plasticulture, right, are earlier production because of the warming soil temperatures. This black plastic, right, creates a warming effect. It can be, 10 degrees difference between the soil under the black plastic and the soil in the alleyways. So it's pretty significant. Reduce leaching of fertilizer. So if you can imagine, right, it rains, you've put fertilizer down underneath this bed and it rains, it's not going to wash it away like it would if these were just exposed, open, bare ground beds, right? And so what you put down can stay there for a little while so the plants can actually take it up. So fewer weeds, it doesn't mean no weeds. Definitely certain weeds can come up through the black plastic. Nutsedge is notorious for this. So keep that in mind. Usually it means the weeds are a little bit more manageable. Increased plant growth. So again, that soil temperature is big, right? Keeping those roots nice and warm. And then there's also this really interesting chimney effect, right? This CO2 builds up underneath and right, plants need CO2 to grow. That's part of photosynthesis. And so these little holes, right, sends up a little bit more CO2 than what would normally be happening. So it's kind of directed CO2. Reduced evaporation and improved quality. So you've got a nice clean surface here. So if it does rain, you're less likely to have this splash come up and check your tomatoes or your peppers. The fruit will be cleaner typically. So there's just a lot of benefits to plasticulture, and it has, obviously you go anywhere with vegetable production and you're going to see it. It's not all roses, right? So you do have to do some management. So as you can see here, this is a field that also has Phytophthora, but you can see the weeds, right, have taken over. So you still have to do some other type of weed management typically, whether it's rototilling or herbicides or something needs to happen usually. So there are some potential disadvantages or at least some considerations to make with plasticulture. So the removal and disposal of plastic mulch and drip tape, right, is definitely something you need to consider. So the mulch needs to be removed. The mulch and the drip tape need to be removed at the end of each season. And you shouldn't leave it in there too long. That mulch is really not meant to stay very long in the field, right? It's a kind of a one-use type of thing. Some growers can get 2 crops on it. But if you, let's say you wait, like you're done in September and you don't pull the plastic until the next spring, you're going to have a mess on your hands. That mulch will be in pieces. It will be all over your field and you will be cleaning it up for the next 20 years. It just doesn't hold together after an extended period of time. And so it can be a real pain to get out if you haven't cleaned it up fairly quickly. If you're in the countryside and not near a dump, paying to throw it out is also can be a challenge, right? So there are, of course, the higher costs compared to bare ground, right? You're getting equipment, you need equipment for installation, right? You need tractor and implement. You must, the drip tape and the plastic mulch are typically a one-time use, right? So you've got to pay money for that and then it gets thrown away. And you must buy and replace each season, right? So there is increased management, that installation, the removal, the timing of it all. So a lot of times in the spring, right, we see this in Kentucky a lot. It's wet it's just, you can't get in the field and it's wet and people want to get in there and lay mulch and there's just not a lot, you can't do it. And so thinking about timing, one way we've done to get around that is we lay the mulch in the fall before it gets cold and, before winter sets in. We go ahead and lay that plastic mulch in the fall for spring production. That of course requires, a lot of prior planning. You have to know what you're going to do and where you're going to put it, right? And so we're doing this for experiments. And so there's timing's really important in that aspect, but not all growers know what they're going to put exactly in a specific field, 6 months out, right? And then of course the equipment, it breaks, needs to be fixed, it needs to be, kept up. All that stuff is important. So just thinking about costs, for example. So drip tape, you can get quite a bit of drip tape for, about $150. It is more expensive the closer the emitters are. So these are 8-inch emitter spacing. It will go up a little bit in price if you go to like a 4-inch emitter spacing. That lay flat, that is for the main line that the drip tape connects to. That's about $100. So again, with plasticulture, you have to do drip irrigation. That's just part of it. So again, you need to have a water source. You need to be willing to put in the time to set up an irrigation system and probably a fertigation system. So being able to apply fertilizer, now you don't have to, but it's much easier if you can apply fertilizer throughout the season versus just at the beginning of the season before you lay the plastic. So fittings, for example, and then the mulch itself. So 3 feet by 4,000 feet, that's about $83. You'd need a fertilizer injector if you're going to fertigate, right? So applying the fertilizer through the drip tape, right? There's a whole host of different fertilizer injectors. They start at around $200 and some, and they can go up from there. If you're doing drip tape and you have an injector, you're going to need a water soluble fertilizer. So for organic growers, this is really hard. There's not a lot of options, but for conventional growers, usually in vegetable production, they use calcium nitrate or potassium nitrate. And those are pretty affordable, $23 for a 50-pound bag. The raised bed mulch layer, for example, usually starts around $2,000 for that implement and goes up from there. And then of course, tractor to pull it and such. So this is not a comprehensive list, but this kind of gives you an idea of bare bones what you would need. So the one thing that keep in mind is there is shared use equipment throughout Kentucky. And so if you check out this directory here and you click on the tractor icon, so this directory has several different things that it can show you, but for shared use, it's the tractor. And if you go in and you hover over, a specific tractor, it will give you more information. And so a pretty handy tool to maybe help avoid some certain costs, right? Like buying a tractor and a plastic mulch layer, for example. So some of that is available for communal use. So that if you're doing plastic mulch, you'd also probably need to do transplants. So if you're growing your own transplants, there is a publication for that to think about. You can buy transplants too. A lot of people do. Certain vegetable crops can be direct seeded. The majority of them do better if they're transplants. So the little seedlings that go in the ground, right? Versus just a seed. Weed management, there's a whole host of weed management publications at this link, and then also irrigation publications at this link. So thinking about that, those are all really important aspects that are involved in just basic vegetable production and plasticulture. I think I have a question here. Are there any recycling centers that will take and recycle the black plastic? No, not in Kentucky. In certain states they do have that, but in Kentucky they do not. So it is unfortunate. Okay, so moving to low tunnels. Really low tunnels is, again, still open field production, but they offer the ability to grow crops through the winter. Temperature management is really crucial. Heat buildup can be a problem, kind of depending on how you manage your low tunnels and your row cover. Lack of light penetration can be a problem, right? So just looking at these, you can't really see through them very well. The choice of the fabric or the plastic depends on the goals and the management options. And you can use a very lightweight row cover or like a permanent low tunnel with a really light row cover as a pest exclusion tool in the summer months. And a lot of organic growers utilize that method when pesticides are not an option. So here's some row cover inside a tunnel, right? We'll get into the high tunnels, but here's just some examples of row cover. So you have a hoop and then you have this cover going over it. Here's another example, hoop and row cover. So these are in a tunnel and so they're not tied down very well. We're not worried about wind, right? But if you're implementing this in the open field, you really need to think about how you're going to keep this row cover from being blown around. And that can be a serious concern. So advantages of row cover, frost protection in the spring and the fall from that increased temperature under the cover. So depending, and we'll go into the specifications of different row covers, but depending on the weight, you can add a pretty significant temperature there under the cover. You get some more rapid plant establishment and growth in the spring and the fall from that increased temperature. And it creates a protective layer around your plants and can keep pests off or out if you have them really well sealed. So obviously something like this would not necessarily keep a pest out, right? It's pretty loose, but if you have it tied down and you have like a real low tunnel where it's secured, it can be a good exclusionary method. Row cover is pretty inexpensive. Low tunnels are pretty reasonable. You can make your own, and I'll show some examples here in a second. And then also what I appreciate about row cover is if you take care of it, you can use it from year to year. And so it's maybe a little bit of money up front, but it can be reused. So if you're thinking about that insect barrier, you want something with really high light transmission. So we're talking something like Agribon 15 or Protect Net, right? It's going to be less than a ½ ounce per square yard. And it's almost pretty much see-through. The Protect Net is see-through. The Agribon 15, it's pretty transparent. The general frost protection is 0.55 ounces per square yard, slightly less light transmission. This would be something like an Agribon 19, it's a little heavier. It's not going to provide a lot of cold protection. It's just for very light frost. Something more for overwintering and really cold temperatures, you'd want something 0.9 or 1.5, the heavy duty stuff, right? 50% light transmission. Something like Agribon 30 or Agribon 50, 6 to 8 degrees of frost protection is possible with the heavy stuff. So here's some examples of some nice kind of low tunnels, or these are kind of almost mezzo tunnels, kind of medium. You can make them out of PVC pipe, right? And you can see these bags along the way here. That's for holding down row cover. And these, these PVC pipes are connected to these blocks. So they're not permanent, but they're probably not going anywhere this season, right? So row cover can be draped directly over plants and held to the ground with rocks, boards, bricks, or sod pins. We use rock bags. We also use long pieces of rebar often. That works really well. You want to leave enough slack in the row cover so that the plants have room to grow. It works well. You can do single rows of plants or several rows, right? Like this. It kind of just depends on your management style. It also depends on the row cover you have. So row cover comes in several different widths, comes in countless lengths. And so thinking about that before you buy your row cover, how do I want to implement this? Maybe you just want one big sheet. And that's what we're currently using in our high tunnel. Is the sheet is basically the size of the high tunnel, right? So it is one giant thing that we take over the whole, all the crop, the whole entire crop in that high tunnel. So it's pretty easy. 2 people can move this back and forth, and it's nice. So building a reusable frame from wood or PVC or that number 9 wire, almost anything can make a low tunnel, and you can make it as permanent or as temporary as you want it to be, right? Some people make almost basically like boxes, right? Like wooden boxes, and they connect their low tunnel, their PVC or their wire that way. And so it's kind of a permanent structure there. So management styles vary based on the crop and the temperatures desired and really what your end goal is. So you could leave on all winter, right? Do you just want this crop to survive until the spring? Or are you actually wanting to harvest periodically during the winter, right? And so thinking about that'll answer do I leave this on all winter or do I take off and remove, right? So we're usually the take off and remove people, right? So take off, put back on, take off, put back on. It's a lot more effort, but it allows on nice warm days, it allows the crop to take advantage of that. They can get hot. So, heat management can be an issue. You don't want, we have an unusually warm day in the winter. You don't want to leave that row cover on probably. And then thinking about the frames of some kind to hold up the fabric can offer an additional layer of protection. So instead of directly touching the crop. And then some things to think about, right? So pests, insects can become trapped under there. So managing the crop before, if this is an overwintering situation, you want to make sure you're basically pest free before the row cover goes on, and especially if it's going to stay on, right? Because those pests can overwinter in the soil near those host plants and then emerge the following spring under that cover and be, ready to go with a free buffet, right? And then the row cover can rub or injure stems and foliage during windy weather. And so if if the leaves are something you plan on selling, right, you want to be mindful of that. Also, injury can lead to disease. Those open wounds can lead to disease. And so you don't want, securing that row cover well, or maybe not having it touch the crop directly can really help. Also, sometimes if it's touching the plants directly, it can freeze to the leaves, which isn't a problem as long as you don't move it, right? So if you wait for it to thaw and then move it, you'll be fine. But if you aren't aware that it's frozen to the leaves and then you try to move it, obviously there's going to be some damage there. Can be really challenging to use on tall plants, just because, especially if you've got hoops and the hoops are only a certain size and the plant grows beyond the hoop, right? Then you're just going to be draping row cover over those plants. And then if you're using this for the summer, right? If you're using this in the warm months as a pest protection, you need to figure out a way to how to pollinate crops. So those self-pollinating crops like tomato or pepper, it probably will be okay because the wind will move that pollen around. But for something like squash, those cucurbits need pollinators. And so if you're excluding pests, that probably means you're excluding those beneficials, those pollinators. And so thinking about how you're going to do that, are you going to remove it? Or are you going to buy some bumblebees and put them under the cover and kind of trap them under the cover and let them go to work? What's your strategy going to be there? And so some potential costs, thinking about this is the pretty lightweight stuff, right? 0.55 ounces per square yard. It's about $52 for about 7 by 500 feet. The heavier stuff, $77 for 7 by 500 feet. The thick stuff, $118. And then there's different sized hoops. So 64-inch wire hoops, or you can get a lot for not much money, right? They come in a bundle, come in a pack. And so thinking about that. But you'd also, of course, need to include all those costs basically from the open field. So chances are you're going to be doing plasticulture, you're going to be doing drip irrigation, you're going to be doing all those other things that we talked about in the first section. So add those costs onto it. So thinking about that. So, okay, high tunnels. So I just want to make sure, because this comes up a lot when someone talks about, a lot of times people use the word greenhouse when really they mean high tunnel. And so let's just iron that out right now. It's a covered structure used to protect plants from sun, wind, excessive rain, and or cold. High tunnels are different from greenhouses in that they are typically passively heated or cooled. Sometimes growers will install fans and heaters after the fact, but a pure high tunnel is the crops are planted in the soil and the tunnel is heated by the sun, right? And cooled by, you raising up the sides and the wind coming through, right? So it's all Mother Nature pretty much, and a little bit of input from you. So why use a high tunnel? What's the benefit there? They can improve many aspects of vegetable production compared to open field. And so extending the growing season, both in the spring and the fall, we're talking planting and harvesting. You can plant earlier, you can harvest later, improving fruit quality. So again, it's a protection similar to that plastic mulch, right? This is like another layer of protection from the elements. So the plants don't get as beat up, the plants don't get rained on, the fruit doesn't get beat up. And so typically there's much higher quality fruit. You're reducing the nutrient and the pesticide transportation, again, because you've got this protective, you've got a roof over these plants, right? And so rain is not going to wash your fertilizer away. It's not going to wash your pesticides off nearly as quickly. And so often that means you don't need to apply as much fertilizer and you don't need to apply pesticides quite as often. You still need to apply them if you're going to apply them, but a few more days between them is actually okay. Protecting plants from severe weather, right? So wind, right now, wind is a big issue. So we can shut our high tunnel. Sunday was a pretty intense windy day, 25 miles an hour wind. And we just shut up the tunnel, right? And everything was okay. You can grow a lot in a relatively small space. And unlike in the open field, you can grow up and trellis from the top of the tunnel, right? Trellis from the inside of the tunnel. So thinking about site selection, right? So these tunnels are in a floodplain. So knowing that ahead of time and thinking about that, it's really important. So location, Orientation of the tunnel to both sun and wind is going to be really important. Access to electricity and water. You may not need electricity. You can definitely put a tunnel in without electricity. We have 2 that are not connected to any sort of electricity, and then we have 2 that are. So what you will need though is water, right? So drip irrigation is going to be a must in a tunnel. And overall, I should say, I didn't say this at the beginning, but vegetable crops perform best with drip irrigation. So overhead irrigation, using a sprinkler, that is not ideal just from a disease management standpoint. It's also not nearly as efficient with water use. And so it is worth it. Drip irrigation has been proven time and time again, in early research that it really does benefit the crop overall. Site preparation is really important for a tunnel. So again, thinking about soil type and drainage. So knowing your soil and your land, are there low spots? Are there areas with poor drainage? Are you in a floodplain, right? So this is an interesting case. So these tunnels, the ground looks flat, right? And it is. But what happens is the water comes off the tunnel, and because there's not great drainage, right, it basically seeps under. So these are the same tunnels. It seeps under the tunnel and comes up here, right? So obviously it's not raining in the tunnel. This is coming from outside. It comes up, over the tunnel, comes off the roof, and then seeps back up under the tunnel. And so this is obviously not an ideal situation. You want, the whole reason you install a tunnel, right, is to have complete control over your irrigation and the moisture management. That is one of the main reasons. And so this is not ideal. So thinking about the sun orientation, east-west is going to have more overall light, but north-south is going to have more uniform light. And so typically we tell people to orient north-south. However, if winds are a problem, if wind is a big issue in your area, you may want to rethink the north-south thing, right? So prevailing winds should be parallel with the tunnel, meaning that the end walls are taking the brunt of the wind, not the side walls. That is the stronger part of the frame. So also thinking about putting those ground posts, at least 4 corners in concrete. And I would recommend this to anyone in Kentucky, putting at least the 4 corners of the tunnel in concrete for wind protection, even if you don't think you have a windy site. And what I would say for me personally, if choosing between wind and sun and how to orient, I would worry about wind first and orient my tunnel accordingly. So again, there's that web soil survey. Grading and deep tillage should be done before you even put this tunnel up. Afterwards, it's not going to help. So making sure it's even, the ground is level. And another thing to think about is perhaps even having the tunnel itself be slightly elevated from the ground outside. And that will also help when water sheds, water comes off the roof of the tunnel, it doesn't immediately seep under the tunnel. That can also help. So if you have it slightly elevated. Fertilizer and water will flow to the low spot. So I've been in a tunnel where it was there was a grade change. And even with drip irrigation, the plants in the back were healthier, greener, taller, because there was a slight grade change. And so more fertilizer was flowing to the back, more water was flowing to the back of the tunnel. And so it's really important to get that as level as possible. And if you are on a hilly site, right, maybe a tunnel is not for you, or maybe not a very big tunnel, right? So maybe go with a smaller tunnel and do what you can with that smaller tunnel. So we'll talk about dimensions, bow spacing, structural material, the layers of plastic, ventilation, irrigation system, and the budget. So dimensions, the tunnels come in all shapes and sizes. You can get a lot done on a 12 by 40 or a 15 by 44-foot tunnel. Those aren't very big. They'd fit in a backyard. You can grow a lot in those. I have 2 of them at South Farm. We fit about 75 tomato plants in a 15 by 44-foot tunnel. And it's not all that cramped, really. You can get a lot in there. The 30 by 96, that's kind of one of the standards. And that's one of the types that, if you're doing equip, if you're getting this, this cost share, right, you can possibly get one of these or a 30 by 72. I see those a lot throughout Kentucky. So the Quonset style, that is going to be your cheapest option. But for Kentucky, we like this Gothic style high tunnel because of this pointed roof, and it sheds rain and snow a lot better, specifically snow. So that's going to be the important thing. Sometimes these Quonset style high tunnels, the snow will just sit there and then it'll collapse through the tunnel, which is not what we want. And then there is the Haygrove style. So, but again, this rounded top is something of a concern. We had a couple Haygroves collapse this year in the ice storm. Because of that weight, it just builds up on top. It doesn't shed nearly as easily as these Gothic styles. So bow spacing, you'll see, so this is a bow, by the way. This can be anywhere between 3 and 6 feet between bows. We recommend no more than 4 feet between bows for Kentucky. That's pretty standard these days. And that is, again, about structural integrity and bearing the weight if it snows. So any further apart, you do risk something coming through those 2 bows and helping to collapse that structure, which you don't want. Thinking about end walls can be any kind of shape and size. You can have a kind of a sliding door like this one. You can have a garage door like this one where it just kind of pulls up. Thinking about the height and the width of necessary equipment. So this one, you can get a tractor in this tunnel, right? But the end wall is just, the door here is just as important, right? So if this wasn't as big as it was, we wouldn't be able to get a tractor in there. Or do you you're okay with, all the tools you have are basically your height or smaller, right? And so basically you just need to be able to get into the tunnel with your BCS, rototiller. That's fine too. The end walls are also very useful for facilitating that ventilation. So opening up these end walls can really help air move, which helps keep the crops from being too humid, having that microclimate, that really humid microclimate, and that's where disease comes. So you want airflow. So sidewalls, also known as side curtains, 4 to 6 feet height. So these are about 4 feet high. The higher the better, again, for ventilation purposes. If you can get 6 feet, that's great. You can have a roll up, or you can have a drop down like this right here. This is kind of both. It has a curtain here that can drop down, and this also rolls down. So, or you can have a hybrid, right? So roll up like this, this is pretty standard, or you can have something that drops down, or you can have kind of a combination of both. So covering, different material, is available. When we talk about the 6 mil polyethylene, that's what's pretty standard on a high tunnel. All we're talking about is 0.006 of an inch. So 6 mil poly usually needs to be replaced about every 4 to 5 years, depending on how well you put it on. So this one lasted about 2 because it wasn't put on very well. So that's really important. Putting the cover on in warm weather is going to be really important for making sure that it stretches appropriately and doesn't get saggy. If you put it on in the cold weather, it's going to be, it's going to get saggy once it warms up, which then leads to this tearing. So you can get some extra insulation and cold temperature, cold protection with 2 layers of plastic. But you will need this kind of inflation fan if you want to use that. So you can blow the air between those 2 layers, and that reduces the moisture and the mold that could build up between those layers, which would lead to less light transmission, right? That's a bad thing. You want more light transmission. You can do all kinds of extra things. This vent, this ridge vent here, this butterfly vent, more ventilation. Right, it can get really hot in these tunnels in the summer, and so you want to keep that irrigation going. If you're in a tunnel, you've got to use drip irrigation, which means you're in control of all the irrigation, all the water. Have to have irrigation ready to go, right, when the season starts. Do you have a municipal water source? Do you have a spigot nearby? Are you going to do rain fed? So you can do the, collect the water that comes off the tunnel, right, into rain barrels, giant rain barrels. Is that going to be enough? There are cost shares available for that. Some people do river water, but thinking about food safety and getting your water tested, even if you have a well water, you need to get it tested. This is, there's a lot of things in the river and it changes. And so making sure you're aware of that isn't ideal. But if you don't have any other source, then maybe that's what you've got to do and you just have to keep an eye on it. Other features, shade cloth, right, can be made from woven fabric. It will reduce the light transmission, but in many cases, that's what you want in the heat of summer. In the peak of summer, that would be what you want, not necessarily any other time, but that can help lessen those abiotic disorders like sun scald or blossom end rot or cracking, all those things that a lot of the tomatoes and peppers suffer from in the heat of summer. There's also movable tunnels, so they're on tracks. And you move them from place to place. So basically it's like rotating, but you're moving land instead of the crop, right? So the tunnel you can see here, the tunnel was here and now it's here and then it's going to be here, right? In the same way here. So that's also an option. There is a movable high tunnel document with the UK Center for Crop Diversification, if you're more interested in that. And then, okay, so here's some quick potential costs. So again, add most of the costs from the open field and the low tunnel row cover probably. And then thinking about, there are kits, right? Here's an example. This is about $7,000. This does not include installation. So adding several $1,000s more, probably $2,000 or so more, depending on who you're working with. The maintenance, right? Replacing that polyethylene cover, that's one layer is about $400. So that's an added component every, 4 to 5 years. And the profits will depend on the market and the crops grown. So tomatoes typically have been shown to be the most profitable crop per square foot. But you've got to think about soil health, disease management, and definitely thinking about crop rotation, right? When using high tunnel, because it's all you have. Unless you have a movable tunnel, you've got to take care of that space. Here are several resources that I found pretty interesting. This was a comparison of a couple of growers that were growing cherry tomatoes. I thought that was interesting. High tunnel economics through the CCD, and then several publications. There's a lot of high tunnel information out there. Okay, so we've progressed from least expensive now to most expensive. So now we're in greenhouse territory, right? It is different from a high tunnel. There is more climate and environmental control. So plants are usually grown in soilless media, not real soil. So potting soil or some sort of media that is not in the ground, right? And so when you're asking for assistance, when you're talking to your county agent, make sure you describe your situation. Are you in soil or are you in pots or bags? Is there heat, or are you providing heat or no heat? Is this a concrete floor? Describe your complete situation, because there kind of are gradations, right, from high tunnel to greenhouse, and some people get really confused with what's what. And so some people have a high tunnel with a heater, right? And so they're growing in real soil, but they also have a heater. So keeping that in mind, pretty much the same things to consider, right? As a high tunnel, you want the right size land. If you're in town, right? Thinking about those zoning and building regulations, making sure you talk to a city planner. Topography and orientation, still north-south is ideal. You shouldn't have to worry about wind nearly as much with a true greenhouse. Of course, water access is going to be even more important in this case, and utilities. So electricity and gas, whatever you end up using, making sure you have that. And then thinking about if you have room for expansion, right? If you're successful and you want to add on, plan for that in the future, the possibility of that. Very similar to a high tunnel as far as design in many cases, but with more options. So the dimensions, you can have similar dimensions as a high tunnel. Bow spacing, we're still talking about 4 feet. Structural material, metal versus wood. So that metal is going to last a lot longer. It's going to be stronger compared to wood. The covering material is more options than a high tunnel. So you could have polyethylene plastic, or you could have corrugated polycarbonate, this hard stuff that you see here, or you could do glass. Ventilation is going to be important unless you're doing a very closed system greenhouse where you're going to be providing the cooling. And then, of course, irrigation and budget are going to influence your design. So the advantages of a greenhouse, right, is you can produce crops all year round. These tomatoes, this photo was taken in early February. So, and look at, they're already pretty far along. So you can produce crops that would not normally grow in Kentucky. You could do something exotic, right? I've seen lemon trees in greenhouses in Kentucky. You get full protection from the weather and other elements. You can really dial in that fertility and plant nutrition, right? You're supplying everything. There's no soil here. So the grower really has to be on point with applying all the nutrients to the plant. And you can control the environment, cooling, heating, ventilation, breeze, no breeze, right? The fan's got to be there or there won't be any air movement. The disadvantages, right? Extra labor is involved, obviously. Energy costs, right? Electricity and heating. Runoff can be a problem, right? So where is all that fertilizer, that extra fertilizer coming out of those pots? Where is that going? And then pollination, right? If you have a closed system, how do things get pollinated? And so you can buy a box of bumblebees, which is fascinating. So the most expensive of all production systems is the greenhouse. So shop around a lot before you buy. Call several companies and get quotes. That's what they're there for. That's why they exist, right? They're trying to sell you something. they will give you quotes with no strings attached. Keep in mind though, the cost of shipping and freight. Cost will depend on many factors. So the size of the structure, how much technology. So is there any automation? Do you want to be able to program things? Are you going to just do heating and then open up the sides, kind of like a high tunnel? Or are you also going to have cooling? Are you going to add lights? That's going to add. And then of course the components, the steel is going to be more expensive than the wood, but it's going to last longer. And then of course the covering, right? This basically goes in price this way. And so this is a chart I found that really talks about the labor and how the average labor hours distributed across, the different tasks. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. Harvest is a huge labor component for tomatoes, almost as much as suckering, pruning, and trellising combined. So tomatoes can be really good money, but they're also a lot of work. So greenhouse costs of production budgets, there's, you can put in different numbers here. This is kind of a spreadsheet that you can work with. Production information, the National Monitoring of Greenhouse Crops, you can get that here. It's called Fert, Dirt, and Squirt. And then eGrow, Electronic Grower Resource Online, that is also for greenhouse production. I think I went a little bit over my time. I apologize for that. But if there are any questions, I can answer them at the end. I'm going to be talking later too. So feel free to put anything in the chat or hit me up later.
Rachel, it looks like we have one question. You already answered the one about the well. So somebody asked, how large of a space or area do you or would you need to benefit from plasticulture?
How say that again?
How large of an area would you need in order to benefit from plasticulture? So I think they're asking, like, where does it make economic sense in terms of size?
That's a good question. So you can do kind of a hybrid. So, and I have a few photos of this. So the smaller growers that don't want to buy or invest in like a plastic layer, for example, you can just use the woven weed mat out in the field. So you won't have a raised bed, but you will have that weed protection that some of the smaller growers that are maybe an acre or less utilize. And so I would say that might be an option if you're really wondering, am I not quite big enough? So I don't think there's necessarily a cutoff. Probably an acre. If you're less than an acre, then yeah, plasticulture. Anyone's going to benefit from it. I should say that. Of course, you're going to benefit from it, but maybe it's not an affordable purchase or affordable expenses for people that are an acre or less. But regardless, anyone would benefit.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. And then the other question that was in the chat box, you've kind of already answered, but they were asking if they should get water testing done if they use wells for their drip irrigation. And I assume that's probably a yes.
Yes. And so there's two sets of water testing, and Cindy may be able to talk more about the from the health and food safety standpoint, that type of water testing. But there is water testing in for nutrients and alkalinity. There's that water testing, and then there's water testing for contamination and pathogens, right? And so those are two different tests. And so you may not need one or the other, but making sure you know which one you need is going to be important. And certainly for food safety, you need the pathogen test. And for example, greenhouse people that are growing in soilless media definitely need the other tests, the nutrients and alkalinity. That is going to you need an annual water test for that so that you can dial in those nutrients appropriately.
And I just put in the chat the Hort directory. You can find water testing labs. So you can look for the farm equipment, like the shared use equipment, and as well as the water labs on there. So that's a really cool resource to look at. So I think that's all the questions that we have for this session. So now, yesterday we heard from a couple of farmers about why they sell at farmers markets as well as roadside stands. So tonight we're going to have a little video from two farmers, one talking about some tips for selling at farmers markets, and the other talking about why they sell at roadside stands as well. So I'm going to get the video queued up here.
I'm Robert McNeil with Highlandmore Nursery in Midway, Kentucky. We've been doing some vegetable sales for the last 5 or 6 years, etc. Some of the thoughts that I have from that vegetable sales of the farmer's market is that if there's 50 different vegetables you could be selling at a farmer's market, there's some that may not sell easily, etc., versus others. Then from how you just sell them, by whether you have a large quantity and weigh them out by the pound and sell them, or have them prepackaged at a unit and sell the unit. When you're at a farmer's market with high traffic, etc., you're losing sales during the time that you're weighing out, or people don't want to stand in line with you and will go to a different vendor, etc. But if you have prepackaged, etc., and it just takes you the time to put them in the bag and collect the money, you're going to be moving more product per unit time, and maybe even at a higher price, because what you can get into a unit doesn't always work out being flush with 50 cents or $1 or whatever you're selling them for, but slightly below that. And third, from a display standpoint, most farmer markets use the flexible tables, white in color, etc., that are 4 foot wide. If you're displaying your vegetables on those kind of tables and having displayed on the full surface, etc., you have individuals that are coming through that market that cannot see what's in the back side of that table. In our case, we went to a shelving type table, etc., that's in the 18 to 24 inch height off the ground, so that when somebody comes and looks at the vegetables, they're looking down on the whole display instead of trying to look through the display, so they're seeing more of what's available to them.
Hi, I'm Joanna Hinton. My husband Jeremy and I own Hinton's Orchard and Farm Market in LaRue County. We have a market at our farm and also another retail location in Elizabethtown. We've been a part of the Certified Farm Market program for I think 19 years this year. So it was one of the first things we did when we started in the orchard business. At that time we were just selling apples, and then the next year added peaches. But over the years, as we have added more vegetables and lots of flowers like you see around me today, the Certified Market program has also grown with us. We take advantage of the education opportunities. We have been able to participate in some of the tours, and just the networking that we have with people involved in the program makes it a very valuable investment for us.
All right. So we are going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back here at 7:10. I am going to teach some more chair stretches, so you can stick around for that if you are interested. We'll just do a quick 2-minute stretch again. But otherwise, get back here at 7:10 for Rachel's next presentation. So the stretches that I wanted to teach you guys tonight are a little bit different from the ones that we did last night. And if you've ever taken a yoga class, you have probably done these stretches, or at least some of them. And so the first one, you place your arms up like this, so like making an L essentially, and you pull your shoulder blades together. And that should feel really good up here in the front of your shoulders as well as in between your shoulder blades. And then you basically pull your hands together and round your back. And then you'll feel the stretch on the back of your shoulders. And then you can pull back and do that opposite stretch again. So pull your shoulder blades together, pull your shoulders back. And then go ahead and put your arms together again. And if you want to intensify the stretch, you can pull your elbows down. So it's kind of stretching the upper part of your shoulders. And we'll do that one more time. Come back together. And then the other stretch that I wanted to show you guys today is one that you've likely done before, and it's very easy. You just stick your arm straight up, and then using the other arm, pull this arm out, essentially. So you're stretching like the side of your body. And it should feel really good right along the side of your ribs and down towards the side of your stomach. And then you can go ahead and switch. So then if you're following along and doing your left hand, you'll put your right hand around your wrist and pull to the right. And you'll probably also feel that stretch up in your armpit area, like right along here. Can feel that stretch really good. And we'll do it one more time on each side, and then we'll take our 3 minutes to go and get something to drink or run to the restroom. All right, and then go to the other side. Okay, so that's it for our stretch tonight. You can keep doing those stretches if you like, but otherwise, take a quick break and we'll be back here at 7:10 with Rachel's next presentation. Hey, Rachel, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, do you want to go ahead and share your screen?
Yes.
So our next presentation, Rachel is going to tell us about ID 36 and what it is and how to use it. So you can go ahead and take it away.
Okay. Okay.
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. So we, the University of Kentucky is unique in that it has this commercial vegetable production guide. Not all universities have this, not all states have this. In fact, for the most part, there are several states that come together to create one production guide altogether. And so we are fairly unique in this comprehensive Kentucky specific guide. And this has been around for many years, long before I was here. And it comes from, the guide is put together by a collaboration between horticulture, plant pathology, and entomology. It is, like I said, specific to Kentucky production. The guide is focused on field production, but much of what is in there is just general useful information for production in general. It's not intended for homeowner use. So occasionally I get those comments that, you know, this is not helpful, and it is intended for a certain scale, and it is intended for people who are going to be selling their product. The other thing to keep in mind is that it is updated every 2 years. So you can see our latest one, 2020 to 2022. So make sure you have the latest guide. It should look like this. And in January 2022, we will have a new one out. So what does all this, so people are usually, can be fairly overwhelmed by ID 36. It's over 100 pages long. So what does all this information, what does it contain? So there is an introductory section. The first few pages contain info on general horticulture, insects, diseases, and weeds, just kind of basic information. There is also information that is just pretty much applicable across all vegetable crops. Each crop has its own section. So, and it's arranged alphabetically, starting with asparagus and ending with vining crops, which includes cucumbers, melons, squash, and pumpkins. So I'm getting my guide out so I can, it's a little easier for me to follow along. So the first 20 or so pages are introductory materials that I would say would be helpful for people who are not familiar with vegetable production or who are still learning, right? Those 20 pages is probably worth it to actually sit down and read. The rest of the guide, though, you do not need to read word for word. And we'll go into that. So all information on growing each crop is included in each crop section. So for example, asparagus, right, has all the information about asparagus. So each crop section contains information on recommended varieties, planting recommendations, such as plant the spacing, the in-row spacing, the between-row spacing, the average number of plants per acre, fertility, so how do you fertilize this crop, the cultural and harvest information, so how to manage the crop, how to take care of it, and then how many days to maturity and how to harvest that crop. And then there is also every crop section contains tables on pest, disease, and weed control options. So this usually means insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides for each crop. Then at the end, the appendix, there are online links for production, marketing, there's conversion tables, and there is sprayer calibration tables. So there's also generic insecticide table and a generic fungicide table. So, okay, where I buy my agricultural products, right? Where I buy my fungicide, they don't have this, but okay, I'm gonna look and see what the equivalent of that, what the cheaper version of that is, right? So how do you use this? So as I said, because it is so comprehensive, I personally don't think you need to read it word for word, front to back. I would say the first 20 pages, the introduction, that would probably be useful for people new to vegetable production. After that, think about what information you actually need, right? So are you looking for variety selection recommendations? Are you looking for crop management recommendations? Are you looking for specific pesticide information on a particular crop, right? So are you having trouble with an insecticide in asparagus, or in a pest issue in asparagus, for example? Then you flip to asparagus and you look for pesticides. I think bottom line is you start with what crops are you growing, or what crop do you intend to grow, right? And you start there. And then you can keep narrowing it down based off of what other information you're looking for. So as far as the different aspects of the guide, so horticulture, right? Each section contains plant in row spacing and between row spacing. Varieties are listed in order of days to maturity, not in alphabetical order. I know that seemed a little counterintuitive to me, but a lot of times people do choose varieties based on the days to maturity, right? They want the earliest or the, latest, that kind of thing. There's also a description provided for those individual varieties. The other thing to note is that the varieties have been evaluated in Kentucky, and they are updated every 2 years. So sometimes certain vegetable varieties fall out, they stop selling them, they stop breeding those particular varieties. We do a search and we cross those off the list, and they don't show up in the newest edition. The pre-plant soil fertility recommendations are listed for each crop, followed by post-plant fertility recommendations. So what you need to put down before you plant the crop, and what you could do to fertilize after planting. So this would be via drip irrigation, fertigation. Additional cultural information included for each crop would be, for example, in tomatoes, there's how to sucker tomatoes. And there's a diagram of how to sucker tomatoes. Another example would be pollination for vine crops, and all those considerations that need to be made in order to properly pollinate vine crops. There's information on harvest and storage as well. So from a weed management standpoint, you think about what crop are you growing, and then what weeds do you have? So proper ID of the weed is very important. So for example, in this field, we see several weeds right here. So not all herbicides work on every weed, and not all herbicides are labeled for your particular crop or your particular production system. For example, if you're bare ground versus plasticulture, there may be challenges using certain herbicides in those situations. So you know the crop, you can get assistance with the proper weed identification, right? That's where you contact your county agent, you take good photos, you send those in, you know what the predominant weeds are in your field, right? Then you think about the time of treatment. So ideally you would think about this before planting, but if you are in this situation, right, like this grower, this would be post, right? This would be post-emergence after weeds emerge. So there's pre-plant, which is prior to planting the crop. There's pre-emergence, which is after planting the crop, but before weeds emerge. There's post-transplant, which is after the crop is transplanted, but before the weeds emerge, or you just cultivated the field, right? So those terms are very important when selecting an herbicide, and they are in the table, and they describe the herbicide, how the herbicide can be used. Then there is the method of herbicide application. So are you going to incorporate? Are you going to just apply it directly on the soil? Are you going to apply it directly to weeds, or are you going to use a directed or shielded approach? Right, so this, right, if you have certain equipment, you will know what you can do with this, right? What your method of application can be. So pest management. We start again with proper insect identification. There is no real prescription or spray program in vegetable production. It's based off of monitoring and scouting the crop. You consider the time to harvest. If within a week from harvest, there are many options may not be available. Are thresholds high enough to justify the cost of spraying? So what I mean by that is there enough damage to the crop, or is there a high enough pest population that you feel that it warrants spraying? And that would be, you could consult with your county agent, and your county agent may consult with a specialist to figure out what that threshold would be. You also need to consider sensitive species and beneficial insects. So are plants in bloom, right? And are bees going to be around? Should you be spraying if there are pollinators nearby? So for example, page 9 has commonly used pesticides and their relative hazards to honeybees. So many of you have heard probably that the honeybee population across the world is dwindling. And so we do need to be mindful of applying pesticides, especially applying pesticides at certain times of day. So bees are typically less active later in the day. So we're talking late afternoon and evening is the best time to apply an insecticide. So if you go to page 9, you can see the whole list of hazardous, moderately hazardous, and relatively non-hazardous. So if you're thinking about pollinators, check this list out, and then you can choose a pesticide based off of that. There's product efficacy. So the table for that is on the back of the inside cover. So on the back cover on the inside, so relative efficacy of insecticides. And so it rates these different products on efficacy. So that it hopefully will help you not choose a product that's not very effective for a specific pest. And then also ask yourself, is the product labeled for your crop? So ID 36 can tell you this, but ultimately you need to read the product label. And you can find that product label, almost all product labels that I know of are available online, and you can double check before you buy. I see is there a question in the chat, Mackenzie?
No, I just put a link to the ID 36.
Okay, thank
so
you.
If people wanted to follow along.
Disease, and you'll hear my rowdy dogs in the background. I apologize for that. Disease management. So from a disease management standpoint, again, proper identification is crucial to treating the disease appropriately. So contact your county agent to help with submitting a sample for diagnosis. Collecting a proper sample is going to be crucial to getting a good diagnosis. So definitely contact your agent beforehand to collect a sample. So typically what they want the whole plant. So roots, some soil, the whole plant. So pull up an entire plant and package it carefully, wrap the roots in newspaper, and that way the lab can look at the entire plant when they're diagnosing your problem. Thinking about what product is labeled for your crop. So again, consulting the product label. ID 36 will have it. So if you go, in this case, right, this is squash in this photo. If you go to the vining crops, it'll list different fungicides, but you should double check the product label. Some crops do have sample fungicide programs. So in some cases, we know, the plant pathologists know, that there are going to be certain problems, certain diseases with certain crops pretty much every season, right? Every year. So for example, the tomato or let's look at the vining crop, because I have it open here. Vining crops, page 109, right? It lists the different weeks. So weeks 1 through 10, it lists the type of crop: cucumber, melon, squash, pumpkin, or watermelon, and then the different products that you could apply each week as a protective application. A lot of this is from a just basic preventative strategy. And it's important to rotate chemistries in this for disease management. You don't want to apply the same fungicide every time, because that is how resistance builds, and then that fungicide will be less effective later on. So let's talk about an example scenario. So let's say a grower wants to plant pumpkins for the first time, and he has no idea what he's doing, right? He just knows he wants to plant pumpkins. So what should he do first, right? So I would say, first of all, prepare ahead of time, thinking 6 months in advance. A lot of times I'll get a call, and it's 2 weeks. Sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes you can pull it off, but sometimes it's not enough. So thinking about what you want to do, think far in advance, go ahead. In that case, if you know nothing about pumpkins, then in this case, it would be very helpful to read the pumpkin section in the vining crops chapter, right? Read it from beginning to end to learn the basic requirements for growing pumpkins. How much space do pumpkins need? What varieties would you want to grow? Looking at the sample fungicide program, is that doable? Do you have the equipment? Can you commit to that kind of maintenance? And then are you going to do plasticulture or bare ground? That'll affect your herbicide or your weed management strategy. Talk to your county agent, tell them what you're thinking about. They may contact a specialist, and it would probably be me in that case. They'll call me. And then the other thing to think about is consulting with other pumpkin growers, right? Go visit a couple of pumpkin fields and talk to growers and talk about the labor and the time involved, and thinking about that. And then also select your potential field where the pumpkins can go. So you're going to base that off the information you've read here, right? And you're going to collect a soil sample, and you're going to help from your agent or the specialist. You can interpret that soil sample and plan accordingly for fertility and planting, right? And so ideally, you'd want to collect a soil sample. I oftentimes tell people to collect a soil sample in the fall for the following spring and summer, and that will give you time to plan. If your soil pH is way off, it'll give you several months to either apply lime or apply sulfur, and to have that fully take effect in the soil, for example. So okay, so another example, right? So a grower is going to plant a 1/4 acre of tomatoes and wants fertilizer recommendations. What does she do first? So first of all, where will the tomatoes be planted, right? Does she plan to fertigate? That's going to be a big question, right? So does she have those capabilities? Collecting a soil sample is going to be really important. And learning what the results mean and how they will affect your tomato crop. So, and I'm going to share a different screen here. So I'm going to swap out here so I can show people. Here we go. So here, I hope everyone can see this, is the tomato section. So you're going to, this grower wants to plant tomatoes. So here is the fertigation recommendation for tomatoes. So pre-plant amount, we're talking about nitrogen. So again, the soil test is going to show you your phosphorus, your potassium, your magnesium, all that stuff. A standard UK soil test does not give you nitrogen because it is kind of a moving target. Nitrogen gets cycled so much in the soil that oftentimes if you collect it in the fall, it's not going to be useful information in the spring if you're looking at nitrogen. So we usually say standard amount of 50 pounds per acre of actual nitrogen, followed by a fertigated amount of 75 to 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen. So we're assuming a growing season of about 10 weeks. So for high tunnel growers, this is going to be a longer season than this, most likely. But for field growers, this is probably what you're going to have. Fertigation can begin 10 to 14 days after transplanting. And the doses for 1,000 plants are based on a plant population of 4,200 plants per acre. So that means your rows are 6 feet apart, right? You've got 6 foot centers and your plants are 18 inches apart. So, and what it means by 5-row blocks is you probably got a drive row there. So you've got 5 rows, a drive row, 5 more rows, a drive row. Is what that means. So for harvest season extending beyond 10 weeks from transplanting, a maintenance dose of 1 to 1.5 N, so 6.5 to 9.7 pounds of calcium nitrate or 11.5 pounds of potassium nitrate per week is adequate. Okay, so then you want, this person wants, she's going to use calcium nitrate, and she's going to use a moderate amount. And this gives the actual N that is being applied, 7 pounds, 8 ounces. But this is the actual amount of fertilizer that she's going to apply. So 48 pounds, 6 ounces per acre, right? Well, she's only got 1/4 of an acre. So that's relatively easy to figure out, right? So 1/4 of that, right? Or she could base it off of how many plants she has in her 1/4 acre. That's also an option. Okay, I'm going to stop that share. So fertilizer and for, okay, I will say if this person's a conventional or organic grower, right? What I just showed you, that was obviously for conventional growers. Page 124 offers guidance for organic growers and the different fertilizers. And then on page 126, it provides guidance on how to calculate fertilizer. You have a rate, you know how much you want to apply of a specific nutrient, and you need to know how much of an actual fertilizer to apply. So for example, this bag 1008, it is 10% nitrogen, right? 0% phosphorus and 8% potash, right? So thinking about, so it's this whole bag does not contain just pure nitrogen, right? It's 10% nitrogen. So if you need 50 pounds per acre of actual nitrogen, you're going to have to apply a lot of this particular fertilizer, right? Calcium nitrate, for example, is about 15.5% nitrogen. So here is a UK soil test.
Rachel?
So, yes.
Can you share your screen again?
Oh, sorry, I thought I did.
It's okay.
Thank you for reminding me. Okay. So I will go back to that just so people can see what this bag. It was probably pretty 1008, 10% nitrogen, right? So the fertilizer bag is always going to tell you what it is, and you can use that information on the bag to calculate how much you'll need. So here is a UK soil test. So this is, getting one of these is important, but also learning what it means and learning to interpret it is equally important. So phosphorus, right? my cursor will show up, right? 277 pounds per acre. So this is in pounds per acre. That is considered very high. So what that means is you don't need to apply anymore. Potassium 288, right at medium. So they are recommending a little bit of potash, right? 70 pounds per acre is not much. The soil pH, in ID 36, it tells you the recommended soil pH. So this is 5.9. You're aiming for about a 6.5. So you know right there that you need to apply lime. Magnesium 166, that's medium. We know that's good, right? And so the reason that the way the lab is able to provide this guidance because the person put in what crop to be grown. That's really important. So they would not be able to provide any recommendations here below if you don't put in a crop here. Let's see, what else? Okay, so here's one more scenario. So a pepper grower notices some bug, they don't know what it is, all over his pepper crop and wants to know what to spray. What should he do first? Get a proper identification of the bug. So he can collect a sample and put it in a jar, right? A sealed jar, and show the county agent. He can take several good photos, very clear, not blurry photos, and email or text the county agent and ask for identification. If the county agent doesn't know, they will contact a specialist. So then the next thing would be, is this bug causing damage to the crop? If so, what kind of damage? So take photos of the damage, right? And then how much damage? Is it on one plant? Is it on all the plants? Estimate a percentage of the crop affected. And that will help guide the threshold, whether to spray or not to spray, right? And then let's say the pest was identified as a stink bug. And so that then you go to the pepper section in ID 36 and you go to the insecticide options for stink bugs on peppers. And so there is a section for that. And I will show you really quick. I need to remember to share my screen. So we're going to go to page 71. So here is insecticide control on peppers. So we are in the pepper section, and then here is stink bugs, right? So it gives the product amount per acre, the seasonal limit. So you're only allowed of this particular product, you're only allowed to apply 8 ounces of that product. And you have to allow 5 days between applications, and you cannot apply it during bloom. So again, this is guidance. You also still need to read the product label. So here are all the currently legal possible applications you could apply to peppers for stink bugs. So again, you could further look up generic products. That's Appendix G. And you may also want to consult that table that I mentioned earlier if you're concerned with beneficials, right? So that table at the beginning of at the earlier part of the presentation that I mentioned, that is taking into consideration hazard to honeybees. So here, right, you've narrowed this down. You may want to think about, at this point, you may want to think about cost, right? What's available to you. Maybe you just cannot get these products where you live, right? The other thing is looking at the efficacy table on the back of in the very back of ID 36, right? So thinking about that, that's also an important component. So I wanted to leave time for people to ask questions if they have specific questions. So that's all I have as far as just examples. I can just keep giving examples, but I don't want to bore people. So those are, 3 examples that for example, that I like questions I have gotten before from growers or from agents. So I'm happy to take questions and guide people to the right section in ID 36, or help you use it a little bit better. If some of you aren't familiar with, if this is the first time you've looked at this publication, you may need a day or two to kind of digest it. But for those of you who have seen this before and have always been kind of overwhelmed by it, hopefully this was at least a little bit helpful. Somebody asked, how do you know if you should use moderate or high doses? So that, I would say, goes to the threshold, goes to the amount of damage that you are seeing, or the number of weeds that you're experiencing in your field. That would be where I would consult a specialist or your county agent and say, this is what I've got. Would you consider this, a high amount of stink bugs, right? A high number of stink bugs, or is this pretty reasonable? And they'll say, oh, that's not that bad, actually. Go with the moderate amount. Okay, what plants should not be planted next to each other that may cause insect? I'm not quite sure what this question is asking. Can you? Okay, I'll answer this other question while the person rephrases. How could you use a soil test if you plant multiple different veggies in one area? And what I would say is, when you're putting in the soil test, when you're submitting the soil test, I would go with the heaviest feeding crop. So for example, if you have tomatoes, that's probably going to be one of your heavier feeders. And then you can consult ID 36, right? And if you're planting lettuce near your tomatoes, right, you just won't fertigate those as much. So, but for a good recommendation on your soil test, you'd want to go with your most valuable, your most, the heaviest feeding crop that you plan to grow, and then work down from there, would be my advice. Certain plants, let's see, what plants should not be planted next to each other that may cause insects to draw near other plants? So that would be, I'd say that is a question you would want to talk to an entomologist about. If you have a certain crop in mind, that is where I would read about that specific crop, and there will be guidance on, okay, don't plant that following this kind of thing. So certainly crop rotation is going to be really important, and that is addressed in ID 36. But as far as planting 2 crops right next to each other in the same season, I can't give you a good example of what you're referring to there. Let's see. For alternative or special crops or fruits, are there other places to look? So there is a fruit guide, fruit management guide. You can probably Google that very quickly, actually. Maybe Cindy or Mackenzie can Google that for us. I think it'll come right up. I'm not sure on the number. That one, I believe, is a multi-state guide. And they can put that in the chat box. Hopefully they can find it relatively quickly. I'm picturing the cover of it in my head. Any other questions? Let's see.
I wasn't able to find it. Rachel, were you able to find it?
I'm looking for it now.
Okay.
Commercial Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide. That's the one I was thinking of, I think. Let's see here. This one's probably the, let's see if this will work. So Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide, that's probably going to be very helpful for people. Other than that, you will need to look at each fruit crop is managed so differently that you will need to look up specific. So there's a strawberry guide, there's a brambles guide, there's tree fruit, different tree fruit. So you'd need to look at those separately. They're not in one comprehensive thing. So much of vegetables, you know, the pre-plant fertilizer, that kind of thing is similar. And so that we are able to group things together. Soil pH is similar. So that in some respects, vegetables can be grouped together because of there's certain similarities and they're annuals. Most of them are annual plants. Let's see. Anything else?
You see the question about, and this is kind of a large question. They say, what are your thoughts on no-till and using cover crops?
So I would say that is a whole presentation in and of itself. I gave one of those talks last year, I think in the Eastern Kentucky Grower Conference. I'm happy to share that presentation with you if you send me your email, but yeah, that is an entirely different talk. Herbicides, no herbicides, you know, that in and of itself is a big question for no-till people. So if you're an organic grower or conventional grower, right, you have different options available to you. It's certainly possible. It can be challenging, but yeah, it's a whole talk in and of itself.
All right, and there's another question in the Q&A, and we kind of talked about this last night, but they're asking, are there any specialty vegetables that are recommended for a small 1-acre farm? They're looking for recommendations for specialty crops like garlic, potatoes, carrots. So I'm going to put in the chat the Hort Biz quiz because we did go over that yesterday, and that's kind of a good place to start. And Cindy had her presentation yesterday when she talked about land, labor, and capital and how that can kind of guide what you might choose to grow. So I will throw that in the chat, Susan, and that is probably a really great place to start, as well as talking with your ag extension associate in your county, because they can kind of go over the results with you and help you decide what might be good for you.
Let's see, the table on page 9. Let's see, pesticide effect on honeybees lists a bunch of fungicides and herbicides. I wasn't aware that they were all potentially hazardous to bees. I'm confused as to why they are listed as pesticides. Fungicides and herbicides are pesticides. So there is an umbrella of pesticides, which includes insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, everything, right? And then you go further in. So yes, all of those things are considered pesticides and could be potentially harmful based off of, you know, their chemistries.
Okay, so I'm not seeing any other questions and we're kind of getting towards the end of our time. So I'm going to go ahead and play a video. This is from Mark Reed of KDA, and it's kind of our last little segment for this evening before we wrap it up. And my cat loves to make appearances on Zoom calls, so I apologize.
Kentucky Department of Agriculture Produce Safety Program. Hi everybody, this is Mark Reed. I'm the Produce Safety Program Manager for the Kentucky Department of Agriculture Produce Safety Program. I want to thank Cindy for inviting me to give just a real short presentation and overview of our program and share with you some important information about our new Kentucky produce safety rules and regulations. The KDA Produce Safety Program actually began in 2018, and actually last year, 2020, was a really big year for the program, as we saw the passage of a Kentucky Produce Safety Statute and a Kentucky Produce Safety Regulation. Both of these rules had the effect of basically adopting the federal produce safety rule by reference. And the good news about that is that rather than FDA inspectors coming on your farm, if you are covered and subject to inspection, you'll actually have the opportunity to work with our program and have Kentucky Department of Agriculture folks that will be on your farm conducting inspections. So that's really good news as far as we're concerned. I want to share with you a couple of major requirements of the Kentucky Produce Safety Rules. The first one is that all growers, whether or not you are covered or exempt, are now required to complete a farm survey for us, and that actually helps us help you determine whether or not your farm might actually be covered by the new rules or not. You can actually get to that survey by going to the KDA Produce Safety webpage. If you simply type in KDA Produce Safety, that'll bring you up to our webpage, and you'll see a link on the right hand side of the page, and even a link, a hyperlink in the text of that information, where you can click on that and complete the farm survey. So again, that's one of the major requirements. Another major requirement of the new rules is that all growers with over $25,000 in yearly sales are required to complete the Produce Safety Alliance Grower Training. That's a training that's offered by our University of Kentucky partners. Right now we've been doing that training monthly, virtually, so you can actually take the course at home on your computer, which is good news, and we'll be doing that at least for a couple more months. For information regarding the course, regarding when the next course will be offered, or for registration, you can give Dr. Paul or Badri a call. That number is 859-257-1546. Again, that's 859-257-1546. The course is free, and after completion of the course, you'll get a certificate, and you can actually display that certificate at your farmers market stands if you've got a location there where you set up. And also, completion of that course actually takes the place of the Produce Best Practices course. And you only have to take this course one time, and again, that certificate from this course will allow you to do sampling at farmers markets. So this season is a big year for KDA. Under the new rules, farms that range in size from $25,000 per year in sales up to $250,000 in sales, that's what FDA calls a very small business. But anyway, those farms actually come online this year for inspection if you're not exempt. And for that matter, really any farm, even if your farm is over that number, if you're over $25,000 to $250,000 in sales per year, or you fall in that category and you haven't yet reached out to KDA, it's very important that you do so now. So again, that we can help you determine whether or not your farm will actually be covered under the new rules and subject to inspections. One other additional service that we offer, if your farm is covered and subject to inspection, is we can do what is called a on-farm readiness review. And that is actually a non-regulatory visit where KDA staff members and University of Kentucky Extension members will actually come to your farm, do a survey, walk around with you, and that will allow you to maybe assess your readiness for an actual regulatory inspection. So again, that's a free service, and we can do that before we actually start the inspection process. Any notes that we take will be left with the grower, so again, we won't have any notes or records with regards to that visit, and again, it'll help you determine your readiness for an inspection and help you determine what, if anything, you might need to work on before we actually do conduct the inspection. So with that, that's just a real brief overview of our KDA Produce Safety Program. Again, if you're a farm and you fall in that $25,000 to $250,000 a year range and you haven't yet reached out to KDA, please make that a priority. Feel free to contact me and we will help you get started. My email is mark.reed@ky.gov. That's mark.reed, and that's REED, @ky.gov. You can also call me on my office phone. That number is 502-782-7809, or you can call me on my cell number, which is 502-229-0341. So with that, I want to thank Cindy again for inviting us to do a real short presentation and overview of the new KDA rules, and also want to wish everyone a very productive growing season this year and the best of luck. So again, if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Okay, so if you have any questions in regard to produce safety, you can contact Mark, and Bethany and I both put his email in the chat box, as well as I threw in his cell phone number. And he just mentioned, just to remind you, if you're making more than $25,000 a year in sales for your farm, you will be required to be compliant with the produce safety rules this year. So that's pretty much all we have for tonight. Tomorrow night, let me pull up my schedule just so I can let you guys know what we're going to be doing. So tomorrow night, we will have Rachel back again to talk about equipment considerations, and then we will start to talk about pesticides with Rick Besson.